Hi, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Nicole T. Pasquale. I'm with the American Association of Chemistry Teachers. Thanks for joining us for a chat with Sam Kean, author of The Disappearing Spoon and Other True Tales of Madness, Love, and the History of the Periodic Table of the Elements. Hi, Sam. How are you doing this evening?
Good. How are you? Hello, everyone.
Good. Well, the purpose of tonight's chat is kind of to talk with Sam and figure out ways that teachers can use the Disappearing Spoon in their classrooms to engage students and generate some ideas around that. And also, we just wanted to have an opportunity to talk with Sam. Just as a reminder, if you're watching this broadcast via Google Plus or YouTube, it is live, so please interact. Please put your questions to us at hashtag SamK Hangout or at AACT Connect, or email us at aactconnect@acs.org, and we'll be taking questions throughout the session. So let's do that. So I think we're ready to get started. If everybody, I'm just gonna sorry 1 second. Put my earphones back in, and then we will get started. Okay. So Sam, I think everybody watching is pretty familiar with the book, but in case they're not, would you mind kind of providing an overview of the book we're talking about tonight?
Sure. So The Disappearing Spoon is kind of a romp through the periodic table. The premise is to find a funny or a spooky or a bizarre story about every single element on the table. And I did manage to fit them all in there. All 118 of them are in there at some point. And basically, the point of it was to just tell stories about every single one of them. There's different themes that the book is divided into. There are chapters on war, chapters on art, some basic chapters of just what the periodic table is, where it comes from, and then what the periodic table might be like in the future. So basically the entire gamut of what the periodic table is, what it means to us, and even a lot of stuff kind of beyond just chemistry. You know, obviously it's very important for chemistry, but there's stories about every single area of human life on there. So really kind of trying to expand people's notions of what the periodic table is even.
Yeah. So you're right, this book it has really great stories, and it's fun, it's interesting, it's entertaining. How did you manage to make the periodic table of the elements something that, you know, doesn't come to mind as being necessarily the most entertaining thing? How did you manage to make it so entertaining? What was your secret to doing that? And how do you think teachers can use that kind of energy and that secret that, you know, all those elements you put together in their classroom?
Right. I've had a lot of people tell me that, you know, the periodic table was the only thing they remembered from their high school chemistry class. And, you know, it's not always fondly sometimes. They didn't understand it or something like that. And I think it really offers a chance to kind of give a friendly introduction to the table. You know, I think a lot of students look at it and, you know, they know they're supposed to be able to get information about it or off of it, but it just seems sort of intimidating. There's, you know, lots of letters on there they're not sure of. So, again, it just kind of introduces them to what the table is and, you know, gives a general sense of how to use it. And I've heard teachers talk about using it in a few different ways. Obviously, there is plenty of science in the book if you want to dive into, you know, the interrelationships among the elements, different things like that, different properties of, you know, the noble gases, or, you know, the column with chlorine, fluorine, all those elements in it, or the other side of the table, whatever you want to. And a lot of teachers, though, have used it as kind of introductions, stories, just telling them stories to kind of get the students interested, get them engaged, you know, talking about sharks or gold rushes, things like that, just to kind of pique their interest, get them excited, and to get them kind of drawn in, and then you can kind of introduce some of the science involved with it. I think the other thing that I've really found out, writing the book, talking about the periodic table to groups, things like that, is that I think stories are just the way the human mind remembers information best. And if you can present information in a story form to people, I think they're more likely to retain it and hold on to it. So it's a good tool on top of just being kind of a good, fun introduction to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the book appeals to a really large audience, I think, because you've managed to bridge chemistry and the real world through the storytelling. Appeals to a wide audience, including chemistry students. So you say, you want teachers have used it as an introduction. What do you hope if a high school student reads this book? What do you hope that they walk away with when they're done reading
I hope they can start to see the connections between the periodic table and lots of other parts of life. I think it's a shame if you come out of chemistry class just thinking that the periodic table belongs to chemistry and that's the only thing that it's good for. And you would never ever think about the periodic table being involved not only in other sciences, but just in lots of different areas of life. So I really hope that what they get out of it is that there's just stories buried all over the periodic table, these little treasures out there. Every element has its own personality, it's unique, and there's something fun or unusual or interesting about it. The other thing I would really hope they get out is just a sense of how science works. One thing I really try to do is talk about how scientists made their discoveries, talked about the times they screwed up, talked about the times they got in fights with each other, things like that, just about how science actually works, why people disagree over scientific topics, which are all important things for students to learn. I mean, there's the factual part of science that you have to have, but there's the part about doing science, what science means, what place it has in our society, and I really did try to emphasize all of those things as well.
it? Absolutely. So, you talk in the book, you obviously love science. You talk in the book about your interest in science, how it developed at a young age. And it seems like it was like an internal process of discovery, kind of what you're talking about, the way science works. Did you at some point though have a teacher or a mentor or professor in your personal life that kind of took this curiosity that you had to the next level and kind of validated your interest in science to the point you thought, I can actually do something with this. I could have a career. I could take this further.
Yeah, I had a few teachers. One in high school and one in college, and making stories. So in fact, I knew some of the stories going into writing the book. To write it, I had these ideas that there are stories out there about elements that no one has ever heard of, but they're really great stories, or there are great hidden stories, backstories to elements that everyone thought they knew really, really well. So in kind of inspired me to think about science in a little different way. It wasn't just the stations, we're going to mix these chemicals together, we're going to do this kind of experiment. They took the time to just spend a little bit of time introducing more about science, and those really, and I was a science major. Took a lot of chemistry, a lot of math, all of those other things as well. But when it came time to figuring out what I wanted to do, I just kept going back to those stories and the things that really engaged me about them, and that's kind of why I decided to do science.
Sorry, you broke up a little bit there at the end. Um,
Oh.
so yeah, sorry about that. So your background is in physics and literature, and you write about science, and you've managed to kind of merge those two passions and scientific and creative parts together. It's one of the many challenges facing educators today, specifically in the K-12 classroom, is being able to prepare students who are both well-versed in science and also have strong communication skills. What advice do you have for teachers that have students who are really strong in science to get them also interested in writing and to have that balance that you talk about and that you were drawn to?
Well, I think one thing you can tell them is that it's in their own interest to be good communicators. I mean, that's the quickest way to get anyone's attention, is to tell them it's for their own good if they learn these kind of things. Because what I found out is, you could have the greatest ideas in the world. You could have discovered something amazing. You could discover a new process for doing something, a new type of energy source, something like that that could really change the world. But if it's just your idea and you can't get it across to someone else,
Right.
you're going to struggle. You're not going to be
Mm-hmm.
able to convince people you have the good idea. You're not going to be able to spread your ideas better. So if you can do that, if you can be a good communicator, you're going to have an advantage over a lot of other people. Another thing I really think that writing does in particular, but just communication in general, is it helps you organize your thoughts, I think. When you have an idea, sometimes it's kind of in your head. It's a little maybe not incoherent, but it's just not as laid out as nicely as it could be. When you have to write it down, it kind of forces you to figure out what's the most important thing, what do I want to emphasize, how everything fits together. They say that you don't really know a topic until you start teaching it, because you figure out, oh, there's gaps here, I don't quite follow it. A lot of the same thing happens when you have to write something. You figure out, oh, I don't quite know how that works, I better look up a little more information, or I don't quite follow this, I better think about that a little more. So you do end up becoming better versed in your own ideas when you have to write them out. So I think those are reasons, if nothing else, to get students interested in being able to communicate science well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wanted to go back to something that you had talked about before. You said that you've heard from teachers who've used the book in their classroom. Was there, and we've also heard at AACT, we've heard from many teachers that they use the book in their classroom. Was there any particular story or feedback or anything, any ideas you heard from a teacher that were particularly interesting, or your favorite way that someone used this book in a creative manner?
I do remember someone talking once about the element aluminum. And for those who haven't read the book, just a brief summary of the aluminum story. And, for a long time, aluminum was actually the most precious metal on Earth. It was worth, way more than gold or silver or any other of those metals were. And, to the point where kings and emperors were fighting to get their hands on this metal. And it's sort of a silly story throwing attention to aluminum. But again, for a long time, it was a very, very precious metal, worth more than even gold was. And I think aluminum, reasons why aluminum was that it's always very tightly bonded to oxygen when you find it in the Earth's crust. So it's very common, but not excuse me, not common to find, or you can't find it really in its pure form. So you can talk a little bit about the science there. Why is it bonded to oxygen? What minerals is it in? Why is it so hard to get pure samples of? You can talk about Charles Hall, the founder of Alcoa, who ended up making a lot of money on this, which always gets people's attention. And you can always look back and say, it's really interesting that this element's fortunes can over time, and that's something that people a long time ago thought was really precious, we don't think of as precious today. So how might that change in the future? What things that we think are really precious now are people in the future going to take for granted and not really think about? So there's some good science in there. I think you can talk about translating science, the benchtop science, the industry, the way Charles Hall did. So you talk a little bit about that transition, which a lot of scientists are going to end up doing in their career. You can also talk a little bit about society, the way it fits into broader societal things. So that was a good example, I think, of a nice lesson where you got to touch on a lot of different things. And I think it's something that students are going to remember. They're just going to look at aluminum in a little different way. And that's really what you want to do as a teacher, is try to change what students are, the way they look at the world.
Yeah, I would definitely remember that tale of aluminum. And we worked with Sam, AACT has worked with Sam to create some videos illustrating some of the tales, and that was one that's actually very popular on the website right now, is the aluminum tale. And I think you mentioned that the lower ranking visitors at a castle or palace, or what was it, used the gold, silverware instead of the aluminum, and that was like one level down from the aluminum, which was which was was the precious one. So I just
Yeah,
read. I'm sorry.
it was the emperor. It was Napoleon the Third. It was an
Napoleon.
emperor,
Okay.
French emperor, and as you said, he had this special aluminum cutlery, and the sort of the higher nobility got to eat with those, and the lesser nobility were reduced to eating with the gold knives and forks. It was very embarrassing if you had to eat with the gold knives and forks, and it's just another one of those details that kind of sticks in your memory and makes you think about it, the chemistry, in a little different way.
Yeah. No, I think that was a good illustration, a good point there. So you managed to tell, aluminum is just one of the many elements that you discuss in this book, and you managed to get all of them in there, which is seemingly unsurmountable task, but you did it. So one question, was it difficult to kind of breathe life into the entire periodic table and to weave them together in the way that you did and have those themes and chapters, or did it kind of come easily to you as you were writing and as you were researching?
Well, actually, when I first was putting together the book, I was going to have 118, individual, very small chapters, and that turned out to be not a great way to organize the book. It was a little choppy, and there obviously are some elements you want to group together. But that I was going to start with hydrogen, go all the way to unum octium, and put them all in order. But obviously, that's not the way the periodic table works. If you're going to talk about chlorine, you want fluorine, bromine, all of those right there with them. So they sort of naturally do group themselves into stories because chemically they're naturally grouped together. So that was one thing, is they do naturally kind of group themselves that way. But another thing was that once I kind of took it apart and looked at it and just talked about what themes were popping up over and over, it did seem like there were certain themes, sections on politics, or, as I said, war, or art, or kind of the future of the periodic table. There was a lot of stories about bubbles for some reason. So there was a chapter in there about bubbles that I put together. And that's not something I would have ever expected going into the book. It's kind of one of the nice surprises you get when you do write a book, is stories pop up that you don't expect. You start to see unusual themes, things like that. So it wasn't that I just sat down and knew all of this stuff was going to, just come out like it did. But I think the structure of the periodic table itself did help structure the book. And then there was some serendipity. I think that's always the case when you write something. It's partly you know what you're going to do, but then you got to be open to new ideas as well.
So I've one question here we got from somebody watching. Was there an element that was the most difficult to find a story about, or one that you found the most interesting? You already mentioned aluminum, but is there another one that that was really difficult to find an interesting story about?
I was doing a radio interview once, and I mentioned that one element was useless. And by the time I got home, I had emails from people who were angry about me mentioning that the element was useless. So I no longer single elements out. That turned out to be a bad idea. There were some of them, though, that are less useful than others, and that just don't have as much use, in part because they're very rare, or with some of the rare earth elements, they're very hard to get pure samples of, so we don't use them as much as other elements that we use all the time, like silicon or carbon, gold, things like that. So there were a few elements in there that didn't kind of rise to the level of having their own section devoted to them or something like that. But even those elements, they have such specialized properties, and especially in the past 20 years or so, we've been able to figure out how to exploit those, that they did end up playing a very important role. One that pops to mind is the element osmium. It's an element that probably no one has really heard of or used or seen or anything like that. But it turns out that when Fritz Haber was basically he was converting the nitrogen in the air into ammonia. It's the basis of all fertilizer, maybe the most important chemical reaction ever in the history of human beings. Turned out one of the catalysts he used was osmium. So it was just something I could slip in there. It was interesting detail about it. And then I could kind of go on and tell the rest of the story of Fritz Haber. So even those elements you can kind of slip in place by place. As far as maybe my favorite element, it's definitely mercury, which is maybe obvious if you read the book. I opened with it. I tried to bring it up as much as possible throughout there. And it's just such a nice combination for me of, it's a gorgeous metal. It's lovely to look at. It's been around since ancient times, so it has a very long history, and a long history in science specifically. Lots of scientists used it. Alchemists were obsessed with it. They were using it for gold mining, all these different things, as medicine for a long time. And I just have personal memories of, breaking thermometers, finding mercury. And I found out that, when I give talks, nothing gets people talking like mercury does. Almost every time someone comes up to me afterward and says, oh, yeah, we played with that when I was a kid. We coated dimes in it. We did all these things. So people talk and talk and talk about it. So mercury is definitely my favorite element.
Cool. Yeah, you definitely mentioned it quite a bit. So were there any, so memory, your memory and, growing up and having this this connection to mercury obviously played a role in the book. Are there any other tales that you kind of have a personal connection to, either that, was a tale that you learned in school, or that, you learned at college, or what have you, or you learned on your own and you thought was really cool? Anything else, any other tales you had like a personal connection to?
I'm trying to think of personal. There was, I think, maybe one story that really stands out for me, as maybe my favorite story in the book is the long chapter about the fight over the names of the periodic table. When the Soviet team and the American team were, they had like this 30-year battle to figure out what they were going to name these elements. And I just found that story just ridiculous on the one level, and funny and unusual. It was something I'd never really thought about, something that never would have occurred to me. Because again, there's that whole row on the bottom of the table you never talk about. It just sits there hanging in the classroom. Who knew? And just to get into that story, it was just sort of a delight that it was there. That one kind of stands out as maybe my favorite story in the book, or one of my favorite stories. As far as like personal connections, I do remember a professor I had in college who worked on things like particle accelerators, and he always had lots of stories about different elements and dangers that they faced or problems, things like that. So those stories kind of stood out because again, there was kind of this personal connection to them, and you could see how these elements in real life really did make a difference, like life and death differences sometimes to people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have a question from the audience. Okay. Were there any interesting stories about the elements that didn't make it into the book, that didn't make the cut?
For the sequel, maybe, yeah. So there was a chapter in the book where I talk about art. I didn't go into the stories as much as I might have about a lot of the pigments that Matisse, Monet, all of these famous painters were using. A lot of them had cadmium in it, poisonous element, arsenic in it, lead, all of these terrible, terrible things that you don't want to have in your body, they were using in their paintings. And I talk about it a little bit in the book, but it's something I could have expanded maybe. It just didn't quite fit in, and you have to make a cut somewhere, and so those didn't quite make it. But
was that your cut, or was that an editor cut?
It was my cut. I just decided that with the way things were shaping up, I kind of had stories for arsenic, cadmium, lead, and other areas. Had to make sure the book didn't get too. I mean, the book could have been like 700 pages.
Sure. Yeah.
I've been able to indulge everything I wanted to talk about, so had to make cuts in a few places. And again, I did talk about other art-related things in there, so I felt like I had covered it somewhat at least.
Sure. So I mentioned this before. I just want to go back. We partnered with you to create videos illustrating the tales of some of the books. Were there any elements or tales that you think lended themselves really well to being represented visually rather than through the text of the book. Although you create, such vivid, vivid imagery with your language. Were there any that you thought, oh, this is going to be a really great video? I'm glad we're doing this.
Yeah, I think the one that we did on manganese and the giant shark, I think, is going to be a fun video, just because it sort of, pops off the page a little more when you can see a giant shark, threatening to attack or something like that. For those who aren't familiar with the story, there used to be this enormous, gigantic shark, millions and millions of years ago, called the megalodon. It was, just huge, like 50-foot long, enormous jaws, could swallow us in one bite, no problem. And he had these teeth, like all sharks do, very hard, very sharp teeth. And when it would die, these teeth would float to the bottom of the ocean floor. And they'd just be lying there on the bottom of the ocean floor. And for some reason, manganese, the element, bonds to them very well. So when they started exploring the bottom of the ocean, in the 1800s especially, they were dredging up all of these sort of cones of crusty manganese, and they would crack it open, see this giant tooth there. They had no idea what this thing was. And it's just an interesting story to think about the connection between this kind of obscure element and this amazing fossilized shark. And then it leads into a little bit, the story about manganese leads into a little bit about some rumors that this giant shark might still be out there today. You can find message boards on obscure corners of the internet, people claiming to have seen one, or they claim that they found one of these giant teeth in a layer of soil that wasn't that old. So maybe there are some still around. And I talk a little bit about why they think that, debunk it a little bit, talk about why it's not likely. But it is kind of a fun story just to go through the whole thing about the giant shark existing, about how some people think it's around today. But you also get a good lesson in the science and what counts as good evidence, what's bad evidence, and how you can sort of sort the two things out. So I think it's a fun story and a good lesson as well.
Absolutely. So we have another question from the audience. You've written 2 books after this, Disappearing Spoon, right? Do you have any plans to write another story about chemistry?
Yeah, my editor and I are actually talking about some ideas now, kind of throwing them around. We haven't quite nailed it down yet, so I'm not quite ready to reveal the specific topic.
Okay.
But we are looking likely to go back to chemistry for the next book. So it's something I feel very comfortable in. I really enjoy the stories. Disappearing Spoon was fun, but there are lots and lots of other tales out there. So we'll probably be going back toward chemistry with the next book. That's
great. We look forward to reading that.
Yeah.
And I think that's all the questions that we had this evening from everybody. But thank you for joining us. And Sam, thank you so much for taking some time out to answer the questions and chat with us. We really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Okay. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye.